Introduction to the Age of Empire. Since we've been studying world cultures and history, I thought it would be appropriate if we were to kind of shift our focus to studying about the history of the United States. So the article starts with the end of isolationism. And isolating means to be by yourself. The United States had once been a colony, its fates and fortunes tied inextricably with those of Great Britain, and found its colonial status quite at odds with its belief in representative government. So this was the time when the United States was tied with Great Britain. As you know and remember, we ended up having the Revolutionary War. We did not like what the King of Great Britain was doing to our colonies, so we decided to separate ourselves from Great Britain. In the late 18th century, a new alliance with France helped the fledgling nation throw off colonial rule. But the help of European powers always came with strings attached, entanglements that American government found potentially dangerous as the nation struggled to grow and thrive. Having observed the effect of foreign alliances on his administration, when George Washington left office, he cautioned his successors to avoid entangling foreign alliances in his farewell address in 1796. So before George Washington left office, he really cautioned the American government to stay away from any outside countries or building relationships with any outside countries. So George Washington, in a sense, was telling Americans or encouraging American governments to isolate themselves, to kind of just worry about their own country at that time. For 100 years, with few exceptions, his successors obeyed. With an ocean separating it from the travails of Europe, the United States quietly developed into a vast and productive country as wars and famines and revolutions elsewhere brought immigrants to its shores. Taking Washington's advice to heart, the United States pursues a policy of isolationism, avoiding alliances and international intrigue as best it could. So throughout time, they took Washington's advice and they ended up issuing a policy or a law that says the United States is just going to be by itself and worry about its own country and not engage with other countries in different matters. But in the late 19th century, all of that changed. In the space of just a few years, from 1898 to 1901, that's 3 years, the United States went from being a former outpost of the British Empire to an imperial power in its own right, claiming territory or influence over no fewer than 5 islands outside its territorial boundaries: Cuba, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. So even though the United States adopted the policy to isolate itself, all of a sudden in these past 3 years, from 1898 to 1901, they decided to gain control over and seek out different countries and islands known as Cuba, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Philippines. So why in such a short time did the United States abandon its policy of isolationism and take on colonies of its own? So that's something to think about. Why would they do that all of a sudden? The scramble for colonies. One explanation for the United States' entry into the imperial game was peer pressure. Between 1870 and 1890, the industrial nations of Europe and Asia, particularly Great Britain, France, Germany, and Japan, scrambled to seize territory in undeveloped world. With unmatched firepower and technology, these imperial powers divided Africa and Asia among themselves. Many in the United States feared that if America didn't join the race for empire, the great powers would leave it behind. So what this is saying is that the United States kind of drifted away from staying as an isolated country because they saw all these other countries around the world taking these opportunities to claim this land that no one had. And America wanted a piece of that. They also wanted to expand their own country and gain more power. What is the point of having colonies? Like the system of mercantilism, under which the American colonies had sent raw materials to Great Britain and purchased finished goods in return, colonialism was a system designed to benefit the imperial power, usually at the expense of the colony. Colonies not only provided sources of valuable raw materials, diamonds, gold, timber, oil, rubber, and many others. For the imperial power, their population served as markets for the industrial products made in their home country. So this benefits America because the more land they have, the more raw materials they can get and export and trade, making them more money. Money and power is what is important to the governments. Markets were particularly important for the United States, which had emerged as the world's leading industrial power in the wake of the Gilded Age. Capitalism could only thrive and expand as long as people purchased the products of industry. And at the end of the 19th century, Americans were beginning to fear that new markets within the United States were drying up. Now that manifest destiny, the belief that God intended the United States to occupy the North American continent from Atlantic to Pacific, has been achieved. In 1893, eminent historian Frederick Jackson Turner declared that the American frontier was now closed, leading many to fear that the pioneering spirit central to the American identity was in jeopardy. What would Americans do now that relentless expansion was no longer possible? Who would Americans be if they no longer had a wilderness to conquer? So what this is saying is that Americans started to panic. They were running out of land. They expanded from the east to the west coast and everywhere in between. They have acquired new colonies, and there's kind of this, well, what do we do now? We have gained all this land. We have used all these resources, and now what? The United States becomes an empire. These questions were still unanswered when disturbing news came from Cuba, where guerrilla rebels were attempting to throw off the yoke of Spanish rule. After an American warship exploded in Havana Harbor, the United States declared war on Spain. Spain was badly outmatched, and within 6 weeks, the United States had triumphed the Spanish-American War. In the process, they had acquired significant influence over Cuba, Hawaii. They claimed Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines as territories. Not everyone was thrilled about the United States' new role as imperial power. The irony that a former colony, which had once rebelled against a distant government across the ocean, was now governing distant peoples, was not lost on contemporary observers. Others protested that imperialism would include people of inferior races in the American body politic. So what this is saying is that people were kind of looking at the United States like, well, you were complaining about being ruled by a country overseas, and now you have expanded and you are doing the same thing to other countries. You have taken over these territories that are super far away, and you are planning on running those countries and territories across the whole world. The Anti-Imperialistic League, which included such diverse characters as steel magnate Andrew Carnegie and labor leader Samuel Gompers, protested the United States' new empire. But many others saw these new territories as signs that the United States has come of age, and it was the duty of the Americans to spread the light of civilization and democracy to the quote-unquote backward people of the world. Convinced of the superiority of people of the Anglo-Saxon descent, these Americans saw it as the white man's burden, which is a phrase taken from a poem by the author and imperialist Buster Rudyard Kipling, to govern and somehow uplift the people of Latin America and the Pacific, whether they wanted it or not. So during this time, America acquired all these new territories, something that they were against when Great Britain was ruling them. The rest of the world is now judging them about how they were upset with Great Britain ruling them, and they're doing the same thing to all these other territories. Acquiring all these new territories definitely increased the power of the United States. And what it's saying at the end of the article is that the United States has put it upon themselves to not only take over these territories, but to then govern them and take care of the people and spread the wonderful thing called democracy, whether those territories or countries wanted that or not. So what do you think? I want you guys to answer these questions in a new document. Why do you think some Americans supported imperialism? So imperialism was the gaining of power. And then why did some oppose it? Was colonialism different than Manifest Destiny, or just a new phase of it? Should the United States have become an empire? How long could the United States have maintained an isolationist policy towards the world? So, think about that. Should the United States have become an empire? Are things better for the United States that they have become an empire? What would have happened if the United States chose to stay isolated from the rest of the world? What would be some pros and cons of those?